A bill was recently passed in California that, among other things, puts into place something known as affirmative consent. And during my internship at the state legislature, I figured out that you really can't trust news articles on what a bill says because I've seen way too many news articles that just have absolutely nothing to do with what the bill actually says. And thankfully, state bills tend to be a lot easier to read and a lot shorter than federal bills. So, after reading the actual bill text, I found that this California bill is neither as good nor as bad as what I'd been reading. Which is why I want to take a look at what this bill actually says and actually does in order to determine whether it's going to be a good thing, a bad thing, or most likely a mix of both. As always, you can find a link to both an article and the bill text in the description. There are several things we need to consider when we're evaluating the bill, such as, does it use gender neutral language? Does it protect both sexes equally? Is it specific enough, or is it too broad and sweeping? Does it help or hurt the current situation with prosecuting rape, crimes of sexual harassment? Because I've mentioned before in at least one of my videos that it used to be too hard to prosecute rape, and especially the victim blaming, and now it's almost too easy to prosecute rape in that there are too many innocent people getting swept up in that. There's not enough checks and balances in the system currently for that. So does it help or hurt that case? And also, is the state going too far? And those are some of the things that we'll take a look at here. In order to receive state funds for student financial assistance, every college and independent post-secondary institution in California must adopt what I consider to be a three-part policy concerning sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And I say three parts because it covers requirements for education, for staff and of students, specific criteria for handling a complaint in one of these crimes, and also some newer definitions, I suppose, of consent. As for the education aspect of it, these colleges must have a trauma-informed training program for campus officials who will be involved in handling the complaints of these crimes, which I think is absolutely fantastic because it's often very tricky to handle these cases because they are so traumatic. And absolutely, people who are going to be handling these cases need to be informed of the best ways to do so. And that's something I think every program should have, every college should have. I think that's extremely important. They must also be able to refer students to existing resources for assistance or make services available to students, including counseling, health, victim advocacy, and legal assistance, and also include references for the same for the accused. And so basically what this does is it makes sure that no one is left not knowing where to go or what to do next. And I actually think that there's not a whole lot currently known by students right now about what to do if something like this happens, about where to go, who to talk to, just kind of left stranded because we don't really talk about it that. So having these resources available, knowing where to go, who to see, make sure that you have someone you can talk to, counseling, advocacy. A lot of people don't even know what legal rights they have in that case, where it can go from there. And of course, the accused needs to be aware of their legal rights and legal assistance as an advocacy as well, in order to make sure that things are handled fairly on both sides, that nobody innocent is charged with these crimes. They must also have a prevention program that includes strategies such as awareness-raising campaigns, primary prevention, bystander intervention, and risk reduction. Outreach programs shall be provided as a part of every incoming student's orientation to make sure students are aware of the institution's policies on the subject, which I think is fair. There's only so much good a policy can do if nobody knows about it. And awareness-raising campaigns, I think, are also important. the more you know about the subject beforehand, I feel like the easier it would be to handle it if it actually happened to you. And I have seen this with some of my friends who have gone through similar traumatic events, is that they don't know what they're supposed to do next, what they can do next. And as a result, there's some lost time in reporting things. There's some evidence lost, and I assure you, it's not because of any malicious intent, but because it's a traumatic experience and they don't know what to do next. They also have some requirements in how an institution should handle the case, being that they have to have an initial response by the institution's personnel to a report of an incident, including requirements specific to assisting the victim, providing information in writing about the importance of preserving evidence, and the identification and location of witnesses. So the moment that something is reported, the institution needs to act on it in order to make sure that the evidence and witnesses, the information is preserved, because the longer you go without having all the stuff in writing and logged and looked at, the more difficult it is to investigate it. And in any crime, the evidence can degrade extremely, extremely quickly. And so it's important to make sure that you get to it beforehand in order to make sure that the case is handled properly, that the guilty are properly prosecuted, and the innocent are not found guilty. They have to provide written notification to the victims for on and off campus resources and services in coordination with law enforcement as appropriate. So again, just making sure that they're aware of the resources. They have to investigate allegations that alcohol or drugs were involved in the incident, especially considering that if someone is incapacitated due to the influence of drugs or alcohol, they are not currently allowed or considered to be able to give affirmative consent or consent at all. They have to have procedures for confidential reporting by victims and third parties, because a lot of times people get concerned, like, what if my name gets out there, and then what are people going to think about me? There's a lot of concern about that, and they don't want people to be afraid to report a legitimate complaint. They also must have a policy for determining whether the elements of the complaint against the accused are backed up by the evidence, which I think is fair to say. Then we get into the consent portion, which is probably the portion that's most new, because they introduced something known as affirmative consent. This is a policy that every institution, post-secondary institution that is going to be receiving state funds for financial aid has to have, where affirmative consent means, quote, affirmative, conscious, and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. So no longer does a lack of protest or resistance mean consent, and silence doesn't mean consent either. Instead, you have to specifically say or specifically indicate, yes, I do in fact consent. This is for both parties. And of course, just as always, affirmative consent can be revoked at any time. And consent cannot be assumed simply because or solely because of a dating relationship or past sexual relations between the persons involved. Doesn't mean that these instances cannot occur between people who are dating or in a relationship who have in the past had sexual relations. But it means that you can't say, oh, well, you're dating, so just dismiss any rape allegations or anything like that. It's something will be considered, but you still have to investigate it. In the event of alleged lack of affirmative consent, it is no excuse that the accused believed there was affirmative consent because the accused was intoxicated or did not take reasonable steps to be sure of affirmative consent. It's also not a valid excuse if the accused believed there was affirmative consent in a variety of different situations where this law says consent cannot be given. such as if the complainant was asleep or unconscious, was incapacitated due to the influence of drugs, alcohol, or medication, or was unable to communicate due to a mental or physical condition. So that is a summary of the bill. The trial by fire ruling is that I was pleased with how specific the wording was in the bill itself. And I'll be curious, though, to see what kind of programs these institutions come up with and what sort of training. Because there is still room for it to become very sexist, these programs, but nothing in the bill requires it or suggests it should be so, because the bill did use gender neutral language. That being said, definitely education is a good thing. I think it definitely has the right intent. There are some instances where I think it just goes too far. But before we go into that, let's discuss affirmative consent a little bit. I think affirmative consent is coming around because the current laws are more subjective about what consent is. There's a lot of interpreting body language, etc., that can easily be misinterpreted. If you look at the legal history of consent and rape specifically, there used to be an issue because in order to prosecute for rape, you had to prove that you did everything you could in order to escape, to get away, to fight it, etc. But on the other hand, women were also being told, and this was focused very heavily on women as the victims at the time, but women were also being told by police and law enforcement, don't fight, don't put up a fight, don't try to escape because you're going to get yourself killed. And to be hurt in this way is one thing, to be killed is another, and you want to be able to live to fight another day. So there's a point where you just have to go along with it, and the more you struggle, the more painful it's going to be physically. So we were getting conflicting messages on what we needed to do in order to protect ourselves. So I think this is really trying to find a more objective way of doing things. So it has a good intention. I'm just not sure this is something that you can really effectively legislate, because this is something that sex is typically between two people in a private environment, not all. So it becomes one person's word over another's, and I don't think affirmative consent is really going to solve that, because you're still going to have people who are dead set on misinterpreting, and you're still going, or ignoring, I should say, and you're still going to have people who are going to try to make false accusations. And this makes it into something that's very contractual, where you have to have proof. Like, you almost have to write out an entire legal document. I'm consenting to the following acts on this day, in this time frame, with this person. These are the conditions for them, etc. And both people sign and date and all that stuff. In fact, they even made an app for that, where you have a voice recording, and it asks you questions, you answer it, and it records your answer. And if you say you've been drinking, then it automatically turns your consent rater thing into non-consensual. And this is really in conflict with a society that views sex as fun or entertainment or, whatever. I tend to view sex as something works best in between two people who, love each other. But that's largely because of the way I was raised. I don't think that it works that way for everybody, and that's not what everybody wants. So long as we as a society don't really make a big deal about sex, I don't see where affirmative consent makes a lot of sense, I guess. But it's easier than just telling people to not be assholes. The fact that there's not a relationship exception makes things tricky. So, does that mean that people in relationships have to continue to get affirmative consent every single time they have sex? And regardless, there's still going to be the issue of one person's word over another. One of the other things I've noticed in the law and also in this particular law is that people who are intoxicated cannot give consent. That is, they can give consent, but it's still not consensual because they're considered to not be able to fully understand the repercussions of their actions and their decision. And so it's essentially protecting them from having regret. I don't get this. I think consent is consent. And the fact that you aren't able to make good decisions when you're drunk is not an excuse for drunk driving. You're still prosecuted for drunk driving because you know that alcohol has this effect on human beings, that it lowers your ability, your cognitive functions and your motor skills and your decision-making skills, etc. And yet we're not excused from things we do when we're drunk, except this. I don't understand where we can be held accountable for things that we do while we're drunk in some cases, but not in the case of sex. I don't think that the state should really protect people from the consequences of their own actions. You know how alcohol is going to affect you. And if you make the choice to get drunk and also to be in an area where this could be an issue and you give consent, then it is consent as far as I am concerned. I would like to see the drunk is not consent thing go away. However, if you're intoxicated and did not give consent or still said no, then it still counts. But consent is consent. If you give consent, it's consent, unless you're under duress. And basically the underlying thing is there's only so much you can protect people from the consequences of their own actions. There's only so much that you can legislate against stupidity, really. It is my hope that people will use this bill to try to bring prosecution for rape and sexual assault crimes, domestic violence, etc. into more of a balance, because where once it was too hard to prosecute, now it's almost too easy to prosecute, and we do see a large sexual bias in that people are more likely to see women as the victims than the aggressors. This is not always the case, and in fact it seems like the numbers are balancing out statistically as to which sex is the aggressor and which is the victim. This has potential to help bring more education about this problem. And the tricky thing is, the odd thing is about these crimes I've noticed is that they're not really treated like other crimes. No other crime is the victim so free from scrutiny, so free from the idea or investigation of the idea that they might be lying or have a reason to lie, motive to lie, etc., for their own gain. For instance, we do see stories where two people had sex and then afterwards one of them is accused of rape just because the other had regrets about the night. If something with a large insurance policy goes missing, of course they suspect the person holding the insurance policy who gets the money. Because we have seen people burn down their own places and stuff like that for the insurance money. When there's a murder, they look at the spouse first. At no other point is the victim or the family of the victim assumed to be telling the truth than this. Because it is such a sensitive topic, it is very difficult, but there has to be a better way to deal with that. And I don't think you can prosecute without evidence. So if it's been a month and all the physical evidence has washed away, and you don't have any witnesses or anything like that anymore, I'm sorry, but you can't risk life of an innocent human being with no evidence. And this is the only case, other than terrorism, where that sort of thing happens, where the requirement of evidence, the burden of proof, is so low. So I would really like to see that leveled back out again as well. So then, in conclusion, this bill has a lot of potential. I think it could do a lot of good. I especially like how much education and training it's going to be bringing in, and I'll be interested, so long as it's applied fairly and is gender neutral, could be a huge asset to the victims of the true victims of these crimes, and also to those who are falsely accused. At the same time, it does have potential to be misused through non-gender neutral programs and programs who continue to paint women as the sole victims of these crimes, because that not only makes it easier for some women to make false accusations, but it also makes it more difficult for men to be heard when they are victims of the same crimes. It's more difficult for them to get justice. So there needs to I understand why they're going with affirmative consent. I am not sure that's the best way to do that. I think there's only so much that you can delve into someone's personal relationship. And there's also the issue of how do you prove it any more than you do now. Some of my suggested changes to the bill would be being more specific about the need for gender neutral programs. And I'm not sure I'm digging this affirmative consent thing, but at the same time, I'm not really sure what they could do instead. So that's something that we can discuss in the comments, and I would be really interested to hear your views and your ideas about what would be some possible solutions. What are some better ways to do this? So there you have it. That's the new California bill. Of course, like I said, the links are in the description. Be sure to like, comment, rate, subscribe, share, etc., because it is very helpful. You can find me on Facebook. I have the link in the description. I also have a blog that I've started called The Phoenix Rising, and that has topics that I don't discuss on YouTube that I'll just simply write about. And so I enjoy doing that. I don't know, you might enjoy that too. Be sure to check it out though. And this is Firewalker saying, tell me what you think are some alternatives or better alternatives to affirmative consent.